All right, guys. So in part one, we started talking about some of the changes to American culture through antebellum reform movements, and we kind of focused on utopian societies or individuals who tried to kind of separate themselves from society and improve themselves, which then would help reach the improvement of America. Again, many of those utopian communities weren't really successful. Many of them died out for whatever reason. Some of them completely left populated America, like the Mormons, and ended up settling in Utah and were completely isolated for years. And so those examples of utopian communities weren't necessarily successful, but you can understand sort of the reaction that many people had during the market revolution. So this next section of the lecture is about the Second Great Awakening, which was also a religious movement, sort of like some of the other ones that we saw before. But this movement was different in the way that it preached more of this active involvement. And so these next groups we're going to talk about wanted to actively, physically change America through legislation, through religion, whatever, rather than just create communities that people could withdraw from and it just improve themselves. So the Second Great Awakening, we learned about the First Great Awakening earlier in American history in the 1730s. The Second Great Awakening starts a little bit later, kind of in the 1790s, but really picks up huge steam in the 1830s as it kind of gets mixed in with some of these other movements at the time. So it's a movement that began with revival frontier meetings on the frontier, and one of the primary figures of this movement, the Great Awakening, is Charles G. Finney. He was a preacher. He preached mostly in Western New York. And a Great Awakening revival was quite a sight to see. They met at these camp meetings, and preachers would get up here in front of people, and they would preach about Christianity and about about salvation and about how that could change your life and those sorts of things. You can see here in the picture that people are literally camped out. You got tents in the background here of the preacher's box, and you've got lots of people here from all around an area. And one of the reasons people showed up in Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Ohio, was because there really wasn't much else going on. So when a camp meeting was announced, a lot of people showed up because it was also a social gathering. Very similar to like a political barbecue, right? You don't see your neighbors, neighbors a few miles away, so here's an opportunity to get together and see them. But the message that the preachers shared reached a lot of people and sort of awakened a religious fervor in the U.S. and particularly, as I said, in Western New York. Western New York had so many of these camp meetings that it was called the burned over region or the burned out region by the 1840s because it was so common to kind of hear and see these preachers all over the place. Notice down here in 1770, there were about 2,000 ministers, registered ministers, self-proclaimed ministers in the United States. By 1845, there were 40,000 self-proclaimed ministers. So you kind of see that this either as an industry or this as a cultural movement exploded over this time period in the U.S. So the Second Great Awakening stressed individual choice for salvation and a personal relationship with Jesus. So, you hear those guys on sometimes Sunday morning, the preachers like, ladies and gentlemen, I would just like you to have a personal relationship with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. If you can just meet with Him, you will meet salvation in the eyes of the Lord, and you will be saved. And that sort of idea and that sort of message was what the Second Great Awakening preached. It criticized selfish individualism developed during the market revolution, and a lot of that was a reaction to the Panic of 1837. When society essentially failed, people looked at this and said, well, why are we doing this? Does industrialism work? Is it going to work? And it just creates this situation where there's people that have and people that have not. So instead, let's focus on improving ourselves. It preached sobriety, self-discipline, and good work. Ironically, as I have down here, these are characteristics that helped the market revolution. People that didn't drink and were on time and showed up and were hard workers actually helped move industry along. even though many of these people were criticizing the industrial environment and the industrial economy. A great way to sort of explain this that kind of sums up really what the Second Great Awakening preached is this picture here called the path, the way of good of evil. So essentially, in your life, there are two paths that you can take, and they have very different outcomes. You could take the path of self-discipline, and you can go to church. You can get educated. You can get a job. You could participate in government. You could be a good husband. You can be a good wife. You could, not drink and not gamble, and that ultimately leads to salvation in heaven. Or you could go the other path where you are not sober, you don't go to church, you end up in bars and drinking, you end up fighting, you end up in jail, and ultimately you end up hung or dead. And that is the path to evil. And you have this picture here with the fire and the brimstone and, the demons and the devil, and versus that of the angel and Bibles and things. So it's very easy visual for people to understand. There are two paths in life. There's the way of good, and there's the way of evil. This one all has to do with your personal relationship with Jesus and your ability to discipline yourself versus not. So the Second Great Awakening preached perfectionism. And the idea that humans were capable of unlimited self-improvement. In a lot of ways, this was kind of similar to the ideas of the Enlightenment, but their version of self-discipline and self-improvement was a little bit different than the Enlightened philosophers. So freedom in their mind was self-discipline. It wasn't the freedom to do whatever you wanted. It was to be free from temptation to do evil. So by not doing something, you are free from temptation. So for example, by not drinking, you are free from the temptation to do evil things because drinking leads to evil things. So it's kind of a different perspective about how to improve yourself. You want to be free from temptation, so you need to kind of give up all your bad habits, and that's self-discipline. A lot of new churches came out of the Second Great Awakening, Baptists and Methodists in particular, which are very, very prominent in particularly the South and Tennessee and sort of the Midwest, Ohio, Western New York. There's a lot of Baptist and Methodist churches around here in Pennsylvania. And they have this same sort of, message about, self-discipline, self-improvement, and perfectionism. And if you've ever been to a Baptist or a Methodist church, there's a lot of fire and brimstone, a lot of, if you don't do this sort of thing, you could end up, the way of evil. Again, which really wasn't all that different than the Puritans and their message and the message of the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, however, ended up kind of turning into a social movement called the temperance movement. One of the things that the Second Great Awakening preachers taught and preached that we could do to actually make America better was not drink, because in the eyes of a lot of these preachers, alcohol was the source of evil in a lot of ways. It was the source of, in this case, a drink leads to talking to someone who's not your wife, who leads to a fight over a girl, leads over to gambling, and then you're intoxicated, you end up out on the streets, you end up robbing someone, and ultimately you end up, taking your own life because of all the sins that you've committed. And under the bridge here, who's left behind but the family, and particularly the wife and the child. In this picture here, you can kind of see the serpent, typically a symbol for devil or evil. And it's coming out of the bottle here of this man who's obviously had too much to drink and passed out. So, the temperance movement preached that, again, self-discipline and not drinking is one of the ways to improve yourself. But Americans drank a lot in the 1800s, mostly because beer was a source of calories. Farmers would typically drink beer at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As I said before, it's not the high kind of alcohol beer that we know today. It was very low in alcohol, but it was part of American culture. Alcohol production had always been an important part of the United States economy. That's why Alexander Hamilton chose an excise tax on whiskey, because Americans drank a lot of it. But again, for reformers, this was the ultimate act of self-control. But it was very difficult to convince Americans not to drink because it was so much a part of our culture. In addition to that, there were many immigrants coming to the United States from places where alcohol was also ingrained in the culture. Places like Western and Northern Europe, and Germany, Ireland, England. Those places, alcohol was a important part of the culture, and a lot of them brought that with them, and were opening up breweries and distilleries in the United States. And so, the temperance movement also then kind of helps breed an anti-immigrant movement along with that. So when you take a look at this picture, you can kind of see, what we're talking about here with anti-immigration. We got, Irish whiskey, lager beer spelled in the German way, and running away with the ballot box. There's fighting, and there's a melee in the background, kind of giving you the idea that, immigrants are bringing with them this cultural thing that's destroying America, right? And this led to a feeling of anti-immigration in the United States. There was a political party called themselves the Know Nothing Party. Their official name was the American Party, that focused on their whole platform was limiting immigration, particularly from places like Ireland and Germany, because they brought with them these characteristics they thought were kind of un-American. And so, the Second Great Awakening gets tied up with this temperance movement. Then also the temperance movement gets connected to this anti-immigrant movement. And so they all sort of become the same, but their goal, again, is to improve America. So by doing all this, by not drinking, by being self-disciplined, by having good work habits, by limiting immigration, we are making America better. Oh, by the way, limiting immigration also creates more jobs for Americans, because of, just like at every single point in history, the immigrants are taking Americans' jobs. And at a point in history where America was in a depression, Panic of 1837, a lot of Americans genuinely believe that, especially in industrial areas. So take a look at this picture here, and think to yourself, which one do you think is a prison, and which one do you think is the castle? Think about that. I'm going to come back in part 3, and we're going to talk about another reform movement here, the American prison system in the U.S.